Well, welcome to our lecture here on Charles Brockton Brown's Wieland. American Gothic is what I'm calling it. That's not very original, sorry about that. But this particular discussion that I want to lay forth here for you about a relatively unknown writer for many, many years, rediscovered in sort of the 1980s, and explored quite extensively since then. In fact, I was quite surprised in preparing for this particular semester how much more scholarship there was on Wieland and on Charles Brockton Brown than there was a mere 20 years ago. I mean, there was just a paucity of material on him. I'm going to start off, of course, talking about Wieland, a novel that was written in 1798. Actually, it took a little while longer than that to get it entirely written. It was published in 1798. There's evidence that he started it much earlier than that. And like so many other fiction writers, Brown got his start writing for magazines, and the monthly magazine in American Review was his big outlet. That was one of the biggies, in fact. So he was not an unknown figure among literary circles in America. It's just that literary circles in America were tiny circles, and so he was rapidly developing a name for himself as a young man. He died as a very young man, so really career that was very much cut short, but was establishing himself as a short fiction writer, as an essayist, and was trying to get some things going in terms of his writing. He wrote a number of different novels. I highly recommend Edgar Huntley. I think it's actually a fine novel. Arthur Mervyn, and a couple of other novels. So there is a body of material here that is surprisingly prolific for a man who died as early as he did. The difficulty, of course, is that, I hate to put it this way, but he was not yet an accomplished writer. And as things go, he's really read more as a sort of a historical figure, as, I'm not going to say an oddity, but probably about the best of what was out there in terms of Gothic fiction. Really, and I'm going to approach this particular lecture more along the lines of what Charles Brockton Brown's Wieland and Brown himself can tell us about what's coming in American fiction, and how he is a real forerunner of the Gothic mode in American fiction. And so really we're going to read this as kind of an exploration of the Gothic mode of fiction in the early Federalist period. The Federalist period, of course, is that period in the 1790s up till about the 1820s. And when we talk about Federalist period, we're talking about sort of everything from the era of the Federalist Papers, where we're trying to figure out, do we want a confederation or a constitutional republic? Well, you know how that was decided. And also in architecture and art and music and those kinds of things. Federalist architecture, for example, is quite interesting and I think very pretty. So this is the Federalist period, the early Republic. And let's talk a little bit about what the Gothic mode is. We brought some of these things up in class, but it's certainly worth our while to kind of reconsider some of those things. When you think about Gothic fiction, most of us think about Gothic fiction that's a little bit more mature than this is. So we think of things like Poe and things of that nature, and Shelley and Frankenstein and all of those sorts of things, all the way up through the late 19th century particularly. And we associate it with old manor homes and dark and stormy nights, ivy-covered buildings and these sorts of things, and for good reason. And in some cases, as people point out, there are different types of Gothic fiction and Gothic traditions. This is the Southern Gothic, and then there's a sort of a modern Gothic, which is especially seen in film. And then you've got spin-offs of the Gothic tradition, everything from vampire novels to werewolf novels and so on and so forth. So, but essentially the Gothic mode, and by the way, where do we get the word Gothic from anyway? Well, it's from Gothic architecture, because it's often associated with, those kinds of Gothic medieval buildings. It's very much something that's rooted, at least in terms of its mise en scène, in the European tradition, right? The old manor homes, the old sort of medieval castles and churches and that sort of stuff. So the Gothic mode of architecture is often associated with it. So we give it that nickname of Gothic fiction, but it has nothing to do with the Gothic period of architecture of the medieval period. It certainly has nothing to do with the Ostrogoths or Visigoths or any number of individuals who sacked Rome in the 5th century AD. So it's really a bit of a misnomer, but it works, and people know what you're talking about when you're talking about Gothic. Now, again, we talked about this earlier. It involves sort of the emphasis on the supernatural, the super rational, that the world is a place that is inhabited by things and forces and spirits and people and entities that are beyond our comprehension. And so fundamentally, it's subversive towards the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason and rationalism, right? It frequently involves characters, as we see in this novel, Carwin and others, whose behavior is unpredictable. It involves plot lines and storylines that involve the remarkable, the unpredictable, sometimes it more than strains credulity that such and such a thing would happen. Of course, you see that in this novel. It's kind of hard to tell in this novel, I'll be honest with you, whether Brown, on certain occasions within the plot, is simply just not very good at weaving the story together. It's rather, ridiculously, the sorts of twists and turns in the plot. Is that because he's just not a very good writer, and these kind of ridiculous circumstances occur out of nowhere just because he's not very much in control of his subject matter, or is he really trying to do something in the Gothic style to show us that anything can happen, sort of thing? But the anything can happen thing is the surprise element. There's also a considerable emphasis in the Gothic tradition on psychology. Now, psychology in the late 1700s and the psychology today, you can hardly, note that there's much in common at all, except for the fact that they're interested in how the human brain works and how human beings behave. Okay, that's true. The dominant psychology back in the 18th century, and you can go look this up and do research on it, there's an awful lot about it, was called faculty psychology. Notion that every human being has certain faculties, and there are ways to appeal to those faculties and manipulate those faculties, and so on and so forth. So it's a bit of a compartmentalization sort of approach to human psychology, which is, to us, very, very simplistic, very far removed from Freudianism or anything like that, or Jungian psychology, or any of the other various theories that have come along in the last 100 years. But there's a very strong emphasis on the unpredictability of human psychology, and of course, therefore, a fascination with people who are mentally unbalanced, right? And not to be taken too lightly, the fact is that Gothic fiction just loves to scare people because it's trying to elicit an emotional response that is irrational in the reader himself or herself, you see. So they want, while you're reading the fiction, to experience that sense of foreboding, that sense of fear, that sense of irrational, superstitious, intuitive danger, and those kinds of things. They want you to feel the realness of it, and they feel that literature can do that for you. What we're going to look at in this particular case isn't just an early example of the American Gothic sort of style, but we're also going to look in particular at how Gothic fiction in America exhibited certain types of characteristics, and why that is, and it's very different from, say, the British sort of Gothic fiction that you see, again, with Shelley and others like that, who might be emphasizing sort of different themes and different implications. And I'm going to try to make the case for the fact that people like Brown, while not a great writer, was one who at least sort of was the pace car of the Gothic tradition in America, and recognized that American Gothic fiction needed to exhibit certain characteristics and traits distinct on their own. And of course, this is the time during the early Republic when the country is getting its own literary and cultural independence after having gotten its political independence as well. So we'll be taking a look at that, and hang on for the ride. It's not going to be following the plot of this novel as though you could carefully. We're not. Our goal here with this lesson isn't really to kind of march through and figure out who did what. I mean, there are passages where you still have to wonder how in the world he used pronouns and what the antecedents are and who did what and how did it happen, etc. And then, of course, the circumlocution and the vague language and the suggestion and innuendo, especially about sexual things, make you wonder exactly what happened, who did what to whom. There's a lot of that. So we're not going to try to untangle that Gordian knot plot-wise, but we are going to try to get through this to kind of pick and choose and glean out of it things that might be handy for us to observe, particularly in the context of later American fiction that was to come along a little bit afterwards. So hang on tight and we'll do that.